All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're talking about a word that, let's be honest, sparks a ton of debate: socialism. We're going to try and go beyond the usual slogans and assumptions. Our goal here is to really cut through the noise and explore its core ideas, the different ways it could look, and of course, the big arguments for and against it. You know, ever since the 2008 financial crisis, and with all the talk about rising inequality, the conversation around economic alternatives has just exploded. And smack in the middle of that conversation, you'll find socialism. So, when people are talking about it, what are they actually talking about? Okay, so at its absolute rock bottom core, socialism is defined by one central idea: that the means of production, we're talking about the factories, the tools, the land, all the stuff we use to create things, are owned socially, not by private individuals. This is the big idea, the one thing you really got to grasp, because everything else we talk about today branches off from this. So, if social ownership is the starting point, what are the guiding values behind it all? Let's break down the four core principles, because it turns out, across a huge spectrum of different socialist models, these four ideas are pretty much the common philosophical ground they all share. So these are the basic building blocks. First up, sociality. This idea that making stuff is a team sport, right? It's a collective effort. Second, there's social responsibility, which means the main goal of the economy should be the well-being of the whole community, not just generating profit. Third, cooperation. The idea of replacing competition with mutual aid. And finally, planning. The idea of consciously organizing our resources to meet people's needs and cut down on waste. Okay, so once you've got those principles down, you immediately hit a huge fork in the road. And that brings us to our first big question: planning versus the market. This is a massive technical puzzle. How do you actually decide where all the resources go in an economy if you don't have private owners calling the shots? On one side of that fork, you have the planned economy. Now, what's really fascinating here is the difference between the dream and the reality. The ideal of central planning was the single, perfect, all-knowing plan handed down from the top. But the reality, in places like the Soviet Union, was something more like an administered system, which was really a messy process of bargaining and haggling between government ministries and different factories. It wasn't quite the perfect, all-knowing machine people imagine. So if you don't have money in the way we think about it, how do you get stuff? Well, one key idea is the labor voucher. It's actually pretty simple. You do a certain amount of work and you get a voucher for that time. You then take that voucher and exchange it for whatever goods you need. And then, and this is the really crucial part, the voucher is canceled. It's destroyed. It can't be saved up and turned into capital. It's basically a receipt for your work, not a tool to get rich. But what if you think that whole central planning thing is just way too complicated or just won't work? The alternative is something called market socialism. The idea here is pretty clever. You keep the market, prices, supply and demand, all that, but you take the profits that are made and you socialize them. That money goes back to the public to fund things like healthcare, education, or infrastructure for everybody. And this table does a great job of showing the different flavors this can take. You've got the Lange model, which uses a central board to kind of set prices through trial and error, and the profits become a social dividend paid out to everyone. Then there's the Yugoslav model, which gave a lot more power to worker-managed companies that competed with each other in a market. And of course, the Chinese model, where the state keeps control over the commanding heights, the most important parts of the economy, while letting markets exist elsewhere. All right, so we've looked at how you move resources around, but that leads us to an even bigger question in our next section. Who actually holds the power? Who's in charge? Who's making the decisions? And here we hit another major split. On one side, you have socialism from above. This is the idea that a centralized group of experts, technocrats, should manage the economy for the public good. But on the other side, you have socialism from below, which is all about decentralizing power and putting it directly into the hands of workers. The goal there is something they call industrial democracy, where the whole boss-employee divide just kind of disappears. So what does that actually look like? Well, this from-below approach relies on some really specific ideas, things like workers' self-management, where the employees literally run their own workplace. It involves coordinating councils between different industries. And there are whole models like participatory economics, or Paracon, where your pay is based on how much effort you put in, not just your job title. Even things like socialized childcare are seen as totally essential to let everyone participate equally. Now, of course, these ideas have faced some really powerful criticisms from day one. And that brings us to the huge intellectual battle that's been going on for more than a century. Can any of this stuff actually work in the real world? So the first giant objection is what's known as the economic calculation problem, which was famously argued by economists like Mises and Hayek. Their point was basically this: without the price signals you get from a free market, a central planner is flying completely blind. They have no real way of knowing what something is worth, which makes it impossible to allocate resources rationally. The modern socialist response to that is pretty simple: computers. The argument is that the information problem Hayek talked about was a real problem for people with pens and paper. But today, with supercomputers and real-time data, a system could totally process the millions of data points needed to coordinate an economy. Think of it like a giant, economy-wide Internet of Things. Okay, the second classic critique is the incentive problem, which you often hear from people like Milton Friedman. The argument here is all about human nature. If you socialize all the profits and rewards, you take away the individual's drive to work hard, to innovate, and to be productive. I mean, why would you go the extra mile if you don't personally get the full reward for it? The counter-argument to that is all about looking to the future. It says that as automation takes over more and more of the boring, necessary jobs, the whole idea of incentives is going to change. When your basic survival isn't on the line every day, your motivation shifts away from just earning a paycheck and more towards things like creativity, personal growth, and just human flourishing. All right, we have covered a lot of ground: the core principles, how resources get allocated, who holds the power, and the huge debates around it all. So for our last section, let's put all these pieces together and see how they form distinct, different models of what socialism could look like. This table is a fantastic way to sum it all up. You can see how the different choices lead to different systems. State socialism combines state ownership with central planning and a technocratic management style. Market socialism keeps the market but pairs it with social ownership. The self-management model lines up cooperative ownership with real workplace democracy. And then you have social democracy, which isn't fully socialist but uses a mixed system, often with government spending, known as Keynesianism, to fund a big welfare state inside of capitalism. And this really gets to the so what of it all. After all the complex theory, it kind of boils down to a fundamental choice about ownership. Why? Because the type of ownership you choose directly determines where the power ends up. If you have public or state ownership, power tends to get centralized in a state bureaucracy. But if you have cooperative ownership, power tends to be decentralized, giving more autonomy directly to workers and their communities. And that really leaves us with a final, powerful question that's not just about textbooks or history. As we think about things like automation, the gig economy, and just what we want our jobs to be like, this isn't an abstract debate. It's really about what kind of future we want to build. Is it one that's directed from the center or one that's built from the ground up? What does the future of work look like to you?